Hello, I am Jyotika. Welcome to Excelling Psychology. In today's class, I will be going through the first part for this lesson, which is going to be on social psychology. Specifically, I'll be going through the section on obedience. At the beginning itself, I want you to know a few things. Firstly, you can take this as a supplementary lesson to understand the content better, or as a revision lesson. Don't take it as the only lesson needed to prepare for your exam, because though I'll be going through the description and the evaluation, to get good grades in the paper, you need to study thoroughly from the textbook. Now this brings me to a question which I'm asked very frequently. Out of the 3 or more textbooks available for Edexcel A-Level Psychology, which is the best one? The best one, according to me, strictly in my opinion, is the book by Professor Flanagan. Professor Flanagan has an excellent reputation of the book she authors across boards, especially the AQA board. So I will strongly recommend studying from that one. And the book is written very, very attractively, in the sense that the content is presented very attractively and the content is very engaging and interesting. So it really develops understanding and critical thinking, while at the same time being very interesting to go through. I'm not saying that the other textbooks are not good, they are excellent in their own respect, but I particularly like and connect with the book by Professor Flanagan. Another thing is this lesson meant for GCE students or international A-level students? See, some of the topics are common in both. Like if I speak about obedience, whether you are doing GCE Edexcel or you're doing IAL Edexcel, you do have to go through the Agentic theory, which I will be covering first. You do have to go through Milgram studies and variation. You also have to go through the factors influencing obedience. So these aspects which are covered in this video is meant for all students. But there's one which is different in GCE and IAL, that is the social power versus the social impact theory. Now GCE has the social impact theory, which is not the same as social power theory in IAL. In this video I'm going to cover social impact theory, not social power theory. Even the textbook, I must point out, is different for IAL students. So when I've recommended Professor Flanagan's textbook, that is for GCE students. IAL students have to refer to a book by Professor Karen Smith, which is written for the IAL course. Now, what is the difference between social impact and social power theory? I will just touch upon this. Social power theory discusses various sources of power, like legitimate power and so forth, expert power. That is a different theory altogether. Don't prepare social impact theory and write it in place of social power theory if you are from IAL. So just to reiterate, I'm going to be doing the GCE wise curriculum in this video. So you can, if you're an IAL student, you can look at the topics which are in common, which are these 3. Social impact you can skip if you are doing this video. Okay, so let me begin with the theories of obedience, and I'm going to be starting with the agency theory. It's not compulsory to remember, but it's good if you can remember that this theory has been given by Milgram. As you know, Milgram's name is very important when it comes to obedience. According to Milgram, we expect that people would operate at an autonomous state. That is, when we think about people, we think that they have a lot of autonomy or freedom in performing their actions. We assume that people decide what they would like to do at any given time. And if this is the case, that a person is performing as per his choices and he is taking responsibility for his actions, then we would say that the individual is in autonomous state. However, there is another state that individuals can operate in. That is known as the agentic state. This is something we don't realize. People sometimes act as agents of others, specifically of authority figures. So many times when we see a person performing an action, it might not be that they're doing it out of their choice, out of their autonomy. Rather, they might be doing it out of agency. Let's say, for example, I see a person taking a dog for a walk. Now, that is a very simple behavior that many of us do regularly. I might assume that the person wants to take the dog for a walk, whereas in reality, it might be a student whose teacher has insisted that the student take their dog out for a walk. So in that case, when the person is performing an action because they've been instructed to by an authority figure, we would say that the person is in an agentic state. As compared to an autonomous state, in this state, the individual does not take responsibility for what they are doing. Rather, they are acting on behalf of someone else. So the responsibility is assumed to lie with the person who is instructed to do them an action. Now, when it comes to obedience, there is a shift that we notice in a person from an autonomous to an agentic state. We can understand this as once a person receives instructions or commands from an authority figure, they stop acting autonomously and they start acting as agents. So this is what is termed as agentic shift. In the previous example, a student might be doing something out of autonomy, such as just roaming around the campus of the college. And that is when they might have been approached by their professor to take their dog for a walk. When they were approached by their professor, at that time they shifted to an agentic state. Now, what is found is that people many a times do not like to be in the agentic state. They feel that what the authority has asked them to do is not fair or is out of the purview of what the authority can ask them to do. Again, in the example that I have given, a teacher has the right to ask a student to perform some academic actions within the classroom or as a part of homework. But asking students to do their personal work is not within the authority of a teacher. But if that is what the teacher is doing, what we would call an abuse of authority, to get his or her personal work done by a student, in that case, the teacher is demanding something that would not be comfortable for the student who's performing it. The student has to perform the action, otherwise there will be repercussions. But the student is not doing it out of will or out of, we can say, out of their own desire to do it. So we observe that when someone has to perform an action against their will just because they have been instructed by an authority figure to do so, they experience anxiety in the form of moral strain. It depends what the authority figure has asked the individual to do, but if it is something that conflicts with their personal moral values, in that case they would definitely experience anxiety or mental discomfort. For example, a student who's been asked to walk a dog knows that it is not within the right of the professor to ask them to do it, and the student's own belief might be that I as a student take my own decisions, I as an individual take my own decisions, and no one can instruct me to do anything against my wish. But at that time, when the professor asks them to do that action, they might find themselves to be helpless. And that is why, what is their personal moral? That they have a right to decide what they should be doing. And what is happening in this situation? They are being forced to do something against their will. This is what causes moral strain in them. So in Milgram's theory, we see how obedience has been explained in terms of moving away from a stage where we are able to take self-responsibility to merely becoming an agent for an individual who has some power over us. Now let us evaluate this theory and see what are its strengths and limitations. One thing is, there's a lot of supportive evidence for this theory. In this video itself ahead, we are going to see many studies by Milgram. All of them support this theory, so there's a lot of empirical evidence. So the explanation of this point I'm just keeping on hold, because very soon I will be coming to those studies. Here I also want to point out that how I'm explaining in this video is for your understanding even of the evaluation points, but this is not how you present evaluation points in the paper. When you write in the paper, you have to use the peel format. You don't have to as such, but some proper formatting has to be there, some standard which you're following while writing your answers. If you want to know more on how to write in the papers, I have covered some videos on answer writing for papers for Edexcel IAL Psychology. You can visit those videos. Right now the video will become too long if I get into that discussion, so I'm not getting into it, but I just want you to know that the way I'm explaining in this video is not the way of writing answers. It's just for your understanding. Now there is a weakness also of this theory. There is a competing argument. There was a study by Perry which questioned the validity of Milgram's findings. Again, this is something that I'll have to keep on hold till we come to Milgram's study, and then I'll explain why Perry has objected to the way that study was conducted. Okay, so just keep in mind when we look at Milgram studies that those points will be applicable here for an evaluation. Another weakness of this theory is that some studies have shown how agentic shift is not inevitable. There was a study with nurses which showed that obedience to an authority figure does not always happen. In this study, the researchers Rank and Jacobson had asked nurses to give a potentially lethal dose of medicine to a patient upon instructions by a doctor, who is the authority figure for nurses. Most of the nurses refused to give that medicine to the patient because they knew that could end up taking away the patient's life. That means, and we will be able to compare this with Milgram's findings ahead, that when it comes to very dire situations and when the individual who is expected to take on the role of the agent is very knowledgeable of what they are being instructed to do, at that time they might not make an agentic shift. So agentic shift might occur only when the individual is not aware of what consequences the action might have, what consequences following the instructions of the authority figure might have, or they don't we can say that they don't have enough knowledge in that area, which we'll see in Milgram's study. The participants did not have knowledge of what they were doing. So agentic shift might occur in certain circumstances but not in others. So this theory might not be able to explain why the agentic shift does not occur at times, because that has not been made a part of the theory. So it might be limited in its scope. And one strength that we see of this theory, it has very good application to the military. We see that in the military, to convince subordinates to perform actions which might be morally debatable, like having military men execute or injure enemies, which can be considered in a sense as inhuman action, bound to create moral strain in whoever has to do it. There in the military, seniors or superiors make sure to use dehumanizing language so that their subordinates do not experience moral strain. As one example, we can think of the term collateral damage. When innocent civilians are killed in the process of getting rid of the enemy by military men, Their seniors would refer to it as collateral damage, trying to take away the fact that they are human beings and not just statistics, and reducing them to statistics so that the people who have performed the murder or who have to perform the murder do not experience moral strain in that situation and end up becoming more obedient to the authority figures. So we can say this theory has been used to induce obedience in individuals in the military. Now what can we conclude? One thing we have to know, in the Edexcel A-Levels curriculum, it is very important to take a balanced conclusion after considering all strengths and weaknesses. When we are writing a 12 or 16 marker answer, we do have to give a conclusion that consolidates the various points that we have given. So overall what we can say is that the agentic theory does explain obedience and gives insights which we have never had before. Like, we have not known before this theory how people shift to agentic states, and that is what gets them to obey. So it presents something new, it gives us a new perspective. But on the other hand, it's also oversimplified, as I just explained in the example of the nurses study. There seem to be other factors, such as I had given the example of knowledge and knowledge of consequences of action specially, which can mediate whether a person will obey or not. Those type of factors have not been discussed in this theory. It's assumed to be universal. So what is required is to take this theory as a base or basic understanding of why obedience occurs, but then to this we will have to add the impact of other factors to be able to understand obedience fully. Coming to the next theory, social impact theory. I just want to remind that for the IAL curriculum, we have the social power theory instead. So this is not meant for IAL students. Okay, when it comes to social impact theory, firstly, what has been explained is the meaning of social impact. Social always refers to interpersonal relationships. So whatever effect people who are really around me or those whom I imagine while performing actions have on me, that is known as social impact. For example, supposing I want to drink or smoke, but when I go to do that action, I remember my parents telling me that that is a very bad thing to do, and then I don't smoke, I don't drink, I give up on that intention. Why have I done it? Because of the imagined presence of my parents. My parents are not there when I'm smoking or drinking, but they are there in my mind. I remember them, and just this imagination is enough to dissuade me from doing the action. That is how social impact can work. And of course, real people can be around, and direct instructions or requests from them can also modify my behavior. For example, when I go to smoke or drink and a teacher actually comes there and asks me very sharply, what are you doing? I might give up on the action. So there, that is the real presence of the teacher which has discouraged me from doing the action. So that is what social impact is. Now in social impact, if we look at it closely, many parties or many individuals are involved. The individual who has an influencing power on another is known as a source. So the teacher who's really next to me or the parent in my imagination will be referred to as source. Then there's a target. The target is the person who's being influenced. In my example, the student who has been influenced by the teacher or by his parents will be referred to as a target. Now Latani, from the famous duo of Darley and Latani, has given a formula on how a source impacts the target. Simply, he has said impact on the target can be understood as a function of S, I and N. So what we need to know is what variables are S, I and N. S is the strength of the source. Literally, what power or what authority the source has over me. For example, if the source is a friend, so my friend has been telling me that don't drink. my friend is not a source in a very strict sense because she's not an authority figure. So she won't have much power over me, or I won't take her very seriously. But a parent or a teacher telling me not to drink is a very powerful source. They have that power over me. They can take action against me if I don't obey them. I will have to face some dire consequences. Or I genuinely feel that they have a right to tell me, and I have that regard for them in my mind, which is why I consider them as very important authority figures. So that is the strength of the source. So if I have a strong source like a parent or teacher impacting me, I am more likely to obey, because we need to connect this to obedience. So how is this standing? See, so obedience is one type of social impact. So here when they say impact on the target, because we are doing a unit on obedience, we should take the impact to be obedience. So if the source is strong, it's someone like a parent or teacher, then the student is more likely to obey. But if the source is weak, it's someone like a stranger or a friend or a sibling, then the individual is less likely to obey. Next is immediacy. Immediacy refers to the closeness of the source. If the source is close to the target, we mean in terms of literal physical presence, available to the target, we can say, then the target is more likely to obey. If the source is away from the target, that means physically apart from the target, then the target is less likely to obey. So let's say, for example, my teacher is standing right next to me and she's telling me, don't you dare drink. In that case, immediacy is very high and I'm more likely to obey. Because of her physical presence, I feel overwhelmed and I don't know how to refuse that instruction. But let's say the teacher was just to give me a message on my phone. Are you drinking? Don't drink. In that case, I would maybe not obey her instruction. At least I'm less likely to obey than if she was physically present in front of me. So what is found is immediacy, in the sense of someone actually being there, the authority figure actually being there. That creates an overwhelming situation when the person feels more of a pressure to obey. But when the person is not immediately available, the individual feels that they can disobey, maybe because they feel that they can deny their actions later, just pretend that they haven't disobeyed the instructions. Like in the example, I could tell the teacher that I have not been drinking, whereas I have. I feel she's not physically present, how will she come to know? Or just because the impact is less, because I'm not fully stimulated by the teacher just being on a message rather than her actual presence, which would take over all my senses in that situation. Also, the number of sources present. Sometimes multiple sources can instruct us to do something. In that case, we are more likely to obey. So let's say there is a teacher and a parent at the same time who are telling me not to do wrong activities. Then I'm more likely to obey. But if there's just a single source, only one teacher, only one parent who's telling me, then relatively I am less likely to obey. And we can understand why that would happen. If one authority figure is so persuasive or so impactful on the individual, then multiple authority figures will definitely be all the more impactful. Now, various effects have also been discussed in this theory, effects of social impact. One is the multiplicative effect. It's a very simple effect. If we increase S, I or N, we are more likely to increase social impact. Again, in the context of obedience, if I want someone to obey, I can increase any one of these factors and that will increase the impact on the target all the more, because we have already seen this. Even one of the factors going up can really pressurize the individual further into obeying. So if, say, I really want, from a sources perspective, we can look at it. So as a parent or as a teacher, I really want, say, a child to start studying. They've not been studying all the time. So what I can do is to really have an impact on that child. I can increase one of these factors. So for example, I can increase strength. Many times you will see this in your home. One of the parent might be stricter. So your mom or your dad is stricter than the other. Say your dad is more strict, you're more fearful of your dad than your mom. So what your mom will do is, when she sees you're not taking her seriously, she will go and tell your dad to talk to you and to instruct you to study because you haven't been studying. Now, why does she do that? She also is an authority figure and she herself could have told you to study. But she knows that your father is having more strength in this case. So she's making use of that strength to get you to study. So even if I can increase one of these factors, the chances that you would obey, that means you would get impacted, are going to be much higher. This is known as multiplicative effect. Then there's also a divisional effect. If there are more targets than sources, so more targets need to obey, then we see as many targets are there, that much of a reciprocal effect takes place on obedience. So let's say there's a teacher who's instructing one student who's a target to not, let's say to study. That is her instruction. The student is likely to obey for reasons we have seen before. Now let's say the teacher has 100 students. That means she has 100 targets. She's taking a seminar or in a large hall, she's telling all of them to study. So she's instructing all of them to study at the same time. Her impact will not be as great as in this case as it was in the previous. And in fact, formulas have been presented for this as well. Her impact will come down to 1 upon 100 for any target. That is the divisional effect. This is the reciprocal we can say reciprocal fraction, but I don't want to get technical, but this is the reciprocal effect, we can say, which it will have on the students. Now, why this would happen, you can understand logically. When a teacher directly confronts only one target, one student, and asks that student to study, S, I and N are all strong, especially S and I are very strong. Her source is high and immediacy is very strong because her physical presence is very high. Imagine a time when a teacher told you directly to study, but when she addresses the entire group of students together, in that case immediacy starts to fall down and even her perceived strength in the eyes of the students comes down. Because they take her to be at a distance. They don't feel that closeness to her. That is why. And another effect that has been explained here is law of diminishing returns. This is speaking about sources. We have seen that if we increase n number of sources present, in that case, there is a greater tendency to obey. The impact is stronger. But now let's consider, what if we increase sources more and more? We just keep on adding more and more sources. So let's say, for example, here a good example will be of a mob. So let's say one individual is asking others to riot against some community or some social group. His impact will be strong. Now let's say 10 individuals are asking others to riot against the community. Again, 10 of them will have a greater impact than just one individual because we have seen about numbers. So numbers are increasing. Then let's say 100 individuals are asking others to riot. Again, because of number, the impact will be very strong because the number of sources is very high. But now let's say instead of 101 individuals are asking an individual to riot, asking the targets to riot. Now the impact will not be very different from what if 100 individuals were asking for the rioting, because just adding one additional source to 100, which is already very strong, will not matter much. You can imagine 100 people asking you to do something versus 101 people asking you to do something. Does not have much of an impact. This is known as law of diminishing returns. It's coming from economics, in which you learn about law of diminishing marginal utility, and you can see it is similar to that, because even that law tells us that adding any one unit does not have much of a substantial impact when it comes to utility or usefulness. Now let us evaluate the social impact theory. Overall, what the theory is telling us is that social impact is a complex process and we need to consider many aspects of the source as well as the target to understand it fully. In terms of evaluation, one strength is that it is supported by research evidence. A study was done by Sedekidis and Jackson, in which they have demonstrated many aspects of this theory in a zookeeping setting. So they went to a zoo, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was a zoo, and there they asked some visitors not to feed the animals who were there. And many aspects were found, such as if the source was strong, like a zoo authority was instructing them not to feed the animals, then they were more likely to obey. But if it was just some ordinary individual asking them not to do that action, then they were less likely to obey. Also, as the number of individuals, that's the targets, who were being instructed not to feed the animals increased, by that proportion we see the impact of telling them not to feed the animals decreased, which we had seen in the case of divisional effect. So multiplicative and divisional effect both were represented in this study, like both were investigated empirically. You can take it as a field experiment, and both were demonstrated that yes, both the effects do actually take place in the real world. This gives ecological validity to this theory. Coming to a weakness, some studies have shown that immediacy, one of the factors which are important in the formula function of SIN, might not be as important as strength, meaning that the weightage given in this theory to all the factors might be unfounded. Some factors might in fact be less important than others. Now, from where is this suggestion coming? There was a study done on nurses in which they were asked by a doctor to administer some medicines to a patient who needed them urgently. It did not matter in this particular study whether the nurses were asked to do that action over the telephone or in person by the doctor. In either case, the nurses were found to be highly obedient. We've seen this previously also in the agentic theory. The same, or we can say similar findings seem to be here, means similar logic could be behind the findings, that when situations are dire and they are pressing, at that time these factors such as agency or even social impact might play out differently as compared to when we are having routine or regular type of obedience. So these theories, be it the previous or this one, don't seem to account for many of the nuances which can take place in real life. Also, if we look at the application of the theory, that is a very big strength because it can be used to enhance political influence. As far as politicians are concerned or the government is concerned, they would very much want citizens to obey them. But we see citizens do not obey when it comes to various instructions given by the authorities. Let's take a very simple example, like let's say paying taxes. Individuals tend to evade taxes as much as possible. Many individuals do that. So to get them to obey and pay the taxes, the government can make use of the SIN formula. As one example, they could send their authorities at the doorsteps of these individuals who are evading taxes. That would create immediacy, having the authority right in front of them. And perhaps it could be tested out that could increase the obedience towards paying taxes. Now let's take a balanced conclusion of social impact theory. On the good side, we have seen again it's a valuable framework for understanding social influence. The strongest part of this theory, in my opinion, is the formulas which have been given. They've really specifically outlined the factors which contribute to obedience. Not only that, they've shown how these factors interact with each other. Any theory which lists out factors which are playing a role in some behavior is very helpful because it can be tested empirically very easily by manipulating or measuring these factors. And also it can help understand the process more holistically rather than in a reductionist way, because so many factors are being said to play a role in impact, not just one factor. And as we know, in psychology, we always learn like the base principle, behavior is very complex. Human behavior is very complex, can never be understood with the help of a single factor. So the comprehensiveness of this theory is a very big strength which we can present in a balanced conclusion. But on the downside, we have seen that though the theory is comprehensive, yet it is simplistic, because there are many real world factors beyond sources and targets which can also influence the way people behave. As we saw in the case of the nurses study, Hoffling's study on nurses, the situation, the context in which people are being asked to obey can also play a very important role. So that has not been looked into enough by this theory. It lacks some amount of depth. That is the initial part of obedience, the theories. Now coming to research, and as we see this research, we should keep in mind the theories, especially the agentic theory, because what we see here is relevant to the agentic theory as well, and it helps in the evaluation of that theory. This part onwards is applicable for both IAL and GCE students. The base study which we have to know very thoroughly with full details we have to memorize is Milgram's original experiment on obedience. This is the same Stanley Milgram who has given the agentic theory. Now Milgram wanted to empirically test his agentic theory, just wanted to gather proof for his theory. So he prepared a simple experiment. He's called it an experiment. Actually it isn't, it's just a laboratory observation. But he's called it an experiment. It's up to you if you want to use that term in the paper. I would suggest against it, because you will not be able to explain what has been manipulated, which is the critical feature of an experiment. So if at all you have to refer to its research method, then please call it a controlled observation or a laboratory observation. Milgram was aiming to investigate when people are asked to perform some destructive obedience. Will they do that just because the authority figure is asking them? If they do that, that means they have been shifted to an agentic state. An agentic shift has taken place. He would be able to demonstrate that. But if they don't do it, then he would not be able to demonstrate the agentic state. What is destructive obedience? Destructive obedience is doing any action upon instruction by an authority which is destructive or damaging towards another person. Now, I have already mentioned at the beginning that I will not be able to cover full details in this video of any theory or study, so you have to go through the textbook. Especially, I want to emphasize that for Milgram study and its variations, you have to learn them in very good detail. I cannot cover so much in the video. Okay, now let's look at the procedure of the study. 40 male participants were included in the study. They were recruited via voluntary sampling from the nearby area of the researchers. These people came from various occupations and professions. So there were postmen, teachers, and engineers, and so forth. Milgram wanted a diverse representation because his intention was to show that people's shift to an agentic state is what causes obedience. Many people had come to believe that it is the evil nature of individuals that makes them obedient. But that is because the world had experienced the Holocaust. Holocaust, as we know, was that tragic event in history in which the Germans massacred millions of Jews. So many people had come to believe Germans are evil by nature, and that is why they were obeying the instructions of Hitler. Milgram wanted to disprove this. And though this is not required to be discussed in the paper, I want you to know Milgram himself was a Jew, and he wanted to prove that Germans are not evil by nature. Milgram believed that any individual would have performed actions similar to the Germans by shifting to an agentic state, and for no other reason, not because of the evilness of their personality, as many people assumed. That is why he took people from different professions and occupations from all walks of life to show that it does not matter where or from what background an individual comes. All that matters is the force of the situation, the creation of an agentic state which causes people to obey. Now, what happened in this study? What were participants required to do? Participants were required to perform a deceptive teaching learning task in this study. Why it is said to be deceptive is because the participant always was assigned to the role of the teacher. The participant was told that one of the participants in the study would take on the role of a teacher and the other would take on the role of a learner. Unknown to the participant, it was the confederate of the researcher, an assistant of the researcher who would always take the learner's role. The genuine participant would feel like the learner is another participant just like him, but actually he was the only genuine participant who was there. So this genuine participant was made to believe that he is drawing a chit out of a hat, which is determining whether he gets the role of the teacher or the learner. But actually it is always the role of the teacher that is assigned to him. Now what the teacher had to do in this study was teach the learner a list of words, paired words associate task was there. So for example, words like say chair, blue, glass, honey, any words would be paired with each other, and such a list of several such words the teacher had to teach the learner. After teaching that list to the learner, the teacher had to test the learner on the memory for the list. So the teacher would show a word to the learner, say chair, during the test, and the learner had to say which was the word that came along with chair. So this type of a task was used. Now what the teacher was instructed was that when he, all the participants are males in this study, so when he was testing the learner at that time, if the learner did not give a right answer, then as a form of punishment, the teacher had to administer an electric shock to the participant. So say for this example, if instead of saying blue, which is the correct answer, the learner says honey, which is the wrong answer, this word was not paired with chair when it was taught, then the learner receives an electric shock from the teacher. We must know right now, actually no shocks were being administered to anybody in this study. It was a fake setup. The teacher was made to believe that he is giving shocks to the learner. The learner was an assistant of the researcher, as we had seen, so the learner was just pretending to receive shocks, but the teacher did not know this. The teacher thought that he was actually giving shocks to the learner. Another instruction that had been given to the teacher was that he was to increase the voltage of the shock by 15 volts every time the learner made a successive mistake. So for example, on the first mistake, the teacher would give the learner a shock of 15 volts as punishment. When the learner made a second mistake, the teacher would give a shock of 30 volts. When the learner made a third mistake, the teacher would give a shock of 45 volts and so forth. As you know, electric shocks are painful. So if the learner was really to get these shocks, they would be an increasing intensity of pain. Many times, the participants would object to this task. They would not like to be the teacher and give this type of punishment to learners. They were concerned about the pain that the learner would be suffering from, because they knew, in their assumption, they were actually giving shocks to the learner. So they thought the learner was really suffering from pain. So they would want to discontinue the experiment, and they would look at the experimenter who was in the room with them, and they would request the experimenter to let them go, to let them stop doing the task. But the experimenter had already decided that whenever the teacher requests to quit like this, he would use a series of prods. Prods are instructions or orders to insist that the teacher continue the task. You can read what these prods are in the textbook. They're an increasing order of demandingness. This is where destructive obedience comes into the picture. The teacher, the genuine participant, is being forced to comply with the orders of the authority figure by using these forceful prods, which are insisting that the teacher continue with the task. If the teacher still insisted that he will quit the experiment even after 4 prods which were fixed were used, in that case the teacher was allowed to leave the experiment. But if the teacher succumbed to any of the prods. That is because it was being insisted that they continue. So they continued. Then it was found that most of the participants continued to give the shocks to the highest voltage possible, which was 450 volts. As many as 65%, which is the majority of participants, they did not discontinue the punishment task. They did not stop giving the so-called shocks to the learners. In fact, they gave a shock even of 450 volts, which is fatal, which can cause death to the learner. They kept on giving shocks up to that point. 65% of participants gave shocks up to 450 volts. This is a very starking example of how destructive obedience can be. Just because the experimenter was instructing them to, they went to a level of giving potentially fatal shock to the learner. In fact, it was found none of the participants quit the study before 300 volt shock. All of the participants, not even the majority, literally all of them continued up to 300 volt shock. At this point, when the 300 volt shock was given, the learner had started pounding on the wall. We have to know one thing. Again, you can refer to your textbook for this and see the diagram. The learner and the teacher were in different rooms when the learner was being tested. So the teacher could not see the learner, but the teacher knew that the learner has been strapped on a chair. The teacher knew that the learner was made to sit in a way that they could not escape the shocks. The teacher used to speak directly on a microphone to the learner, but the learner never responded verbally. The learner would press a button to give the answer, and the teacher could see what button the learner had pressed on his screen. So there was no way that the learner could communicate to the teacher that they were in pain. So the way they had removed was that the learner would pretend to slam against the wall because he was tied on the chair, could not escape. So he would start hammering or pounding on the wall to pretend as if he's in a lot of pain. This he started doing during the 300 volt shock which was given. And so there were a few participants who quit at this time because they felt the shocks had become way too painful for the learner. But despite this, despite learning about the pounding, 65% of the participants continued till the potentially fatal shock level of 450 volts. Now the question is, when participants gave these type of shocks, which was such high in voltage, were they indifferent to what they were doing? Did they seem to be cruel or evil by nature? The answer is no. In fact, most of them were very disturbed and distressed. The participants who were administering the shocks, the genuine participants, they would shake, tremble, cry. One of the participants even had a seizure while giving the shocks, such that they had to terminate the experiment for that participants. So participants were clearly giving the shock only to obey the authority figure, and not because of their evil nature, because they were enjoying doing that. Their behavior was not at all that of enjoyment. So what we can conclude from this study is that what Milgram proposed in the agentic theory was true. People do acts of destructive obedience in an agentic state, and not because that is their nature. In fact, they are surprisingly obedient to authority. Why they have used the word surprisingly is because before they could start with the experiment, they had just randomly asked a few people, what if they were to do an experiment like this? What did the people think? Would people give such high levels of shock? All of them said no. They did not believe that anyone can give these levels of shock. Yet the results of the experiment tell otherwise. Now in your Edexcel Psychology course, whenever you learn a study, you must explicitly link as much of it as possible to theories and knowledge that you have acquired earlier. So in the agentic theory, we had seen something about moral strain. These participants were clearly experiencing moral strain when they were doing this task, as we saw by their symptoms and signs of distress. So clearly the task was against their conscience, and yet they were doing it, which shows that in an agentic state, even moral strain cannot prevent participants from doing destructive obedience. Let us now evaluate this study. This study is very reliable because it has the standardized procedure. There are so many examples of standardization in this study. The way in which the voltage was to be increased in increments of 15 volts every time the learner made a mistake. The way the teacher was made to believe that he had been randomly assigned and put into the teaching position. Although participants were tested individually in this study, everything was done in the exact same way for each and every participant, meaning that because of standardization, the reliability or consistency of the results are very strong. But a weakness of the study's realism is really questionable. Ecological validity is poor. In real life, when destructive obedience takes place, it is not so systematic in its nature, and tasks are generally not to give electric shocks for someone who's making mistakes in a simple teaching learning task. If we see examples of destructive obedience as done by terrorists or as done by Germans during the Holocaust, they were outright brutal murders and injuries which they performed, like they injured people. And there's no system to it that, oh, you have to increase the injury by this much percentage. Like in this study, they increase the voltage. It's not like that. There's just a sudden order by the authority figure, go charge, go shoot everybody. That's how destructive obedience works in real life. It's unpredictable. No one can anticipate. And that we are not sure whether the results of this study would apply to those type of scenarios, which are very different from the systematic scenario in this study. Another major weakness of this study is ethical concerns. We know ethical concerns don't weigh in directly in how a study relates to a theory, but by itself the study is very ethically concerning. We can read Professor Baumrind's criticism of this study ethically. What Professor Baumrind has strongly argued is, even if participants are volunteers in a study, that is, they willingly come for a study, still we cannot subject them to so much emotional distress like Milgram subjected the teachers to in this study. So that is why there was tremendous psychological harm in this study. We saw a participant even got seizures. And in fact, there's a lot of deception in this study. Participants thought really the learner was getting shocks, and they thought the teaching learning process was authentic. They thought the experimenter really wanted to punish the learner so that he learns better. All of this was false. There were no shocks and there was no actual learning teaching task which was going on. Application of this study is a strong point. Milgram's findings do have practical value in a counterfactual sense. In this study, we see participants were not able to raise their voice. A majority of them continued to obey destructively. Yes, there was a good minority of participants, 35%, who quit at some time. Taking inspiration from those participants and taking counter inspiration from those who continued till the end, we learn that it's very important to raise our voice against authority if we want to stop destructive behaviors in this world. So being more assertive and challenging authority, how important it is, given that how much a person could have to suffer. Like in this study, if the shocks were real, another person could have died because of the behavior of the participants. That is how destructive obedience can be. We get to see from this study. So it shows us the value of being assertive and being able to challenge authority. Now, Milgram also did many variations on his study. He kept on manipulating different factors to see. As we have seen, many factors are related to obedience, and we will see ahead also. So if we change any of these factors using the same paradigm that is used in the original study, will that impact how much participants obey? So in one variation of his study, again the paradigm being the same, Milgram established a new baseline. The experiment was exactly the same except for one part of the study. In the beginning, the learner, Mr. Wallace, he told participants that he had a mild heart condition. Already shocks are very painful and potentially destructive. This time the learner told them explicitly, told the participants that he had a mild heart condition. That means the shocks could prove to be even more destructive for him. Yet we see that participants still continued to give the shocks even up to 450 volts. Exactly the same result of the original study was replicated in this variation. In this variation also 65%, which is a big majority, continued to give shocks. That means obedience can be so destructive that the victim's serious medical condition would not be taken into account if someone was obeying an authority figure. Now in the syllabus, this new baseline variation is not there as such, but we do have the next 3 variations. So at a minimum, learn the next 3. What Milgram felt was his original study he had done in the prestigious Yale University. So that could be the reason for why participants obeyed. He wanted to rule out this possibility. He wanted to show that obedience occurs only because of the pressure put by the authority figure and for no other reason. So what he did, he replicated his study in a rundown office block. Rundown office block means it was definitely not as prestigious as the Yale University. In fact, it looked like a very indescript type of a place. And here he found obedience decreased, not very significantly. From 65% it came down to 47.5%, but it did come down. So to some extent he understood that even where the person is being asked to obey can play an important role in whether the person obeys or not. The more prestigious or more reputed the place where the person is being asked to obey, the more likely that he will show obedience. Try to memorize the figures of how many participants obeyed, the percentages at least, for all the studies, all the variations. In one of the variations, Milgram wanted to test the immediacy factor of obedience. He wanted to see if the experimenter is not physically present while giving commands to administer the shocks to the participant. In that case, will participants obey his instructions? So what he did, he made the experimenter give orders over the telephone to the participants that they should obey. And in this case, obedience did come down significantly. This time, only a minority was obedient. So only 22.5% of the participants obeyed instructions. The vast majority did not obey. That means immediacy of physical presence of the experimenter is very important to get participants to obey. And in a final variation, Milgram made an ordinary man give orders. That is, instead of having a reputed individual like an experimenter order the participants to give electric shocks, he made just any assistant with no reputation known to give the orders for giving shocks to the participants. And this time only 20% obeyed. As Milgram had expected, the pressure put by the authority figure is the chief factor which results in obedience. So when the authority figure is not credible, it's just about anyone who's giving orders, that time obedience is the most affected. It comes down to 20% from 65%. What we learn from all these studies is, and this we can count as a strength, that situational factors greatly influence obedience levels. Factors like where obedience has to be done, who is asking the person to obey, and so forth can really matter when it comes to obedience. This is a very important learning to take away from these variations. Also, we see legitimacy of the authority, physical presence, settings. These are the situational factors playing a role. So every variation of Milgram has thrown light into more and more factors that play a role in obedience, really increasing our knowledge about the phenomenon. But it has certain weaknesses as well. There is potential contamination of the results of these studies. Lots of participants took part in various Milgram's studies. It has been estimated up to 900 participants or more took part in either his original study or the variations. When so many people participate in a type of study, it is bound to be that they will spread out the word of what happens in these type of studies. So say I have participated in one of these experiments, I go and discuss it with my friends and family, even though the experimenter must have requested me not to. Now like this, the word keeps spreading from me to others and then from those others to even others on what these experiments are about. Now when we conduct new studies of the same type, how can we be sure that the participants who are coming in don't have any knowledge about the studies already? What if they've already learned about the study from their friends, then they're coming in, and then just to get along with what is expected in the study, they show obedience, not because they're genuinely feeling pressurized by the authority figure. This is the contamination that they're speaking about. That participants might not be naive to the experiment when they enter, and that's why their prejudices when they enter could be influencing their behavior, which would reduce validity. Another weakness is in the ordinary man variation, which is there, internal validity seems to be very doubtful. In the ordinary man variation, we have seen that an ordinary person gave the instructions, but if we see that variation carefully, that ordinary man just did not come in randomly and start giving instructions. He was authorized by the experimenter to give instructions before the experimenter left the room. Now, if you're the participant and you see that the experimenter is giving charge to someone else to give the instructions, would you consider that someone else to be an ordinary person or a representative of the experimenter? So for you, that person could be as good as the experimenter. And you would assume it's the experimenter only in one sense who's giving you the instructions to give the shocks. So is the ordinary person really perceived to be an ordinary person in these type of variations, or is he still taken to be a legitimate authority figure? That is questionable, which reduces internal validity. So what do we conclude from looking at these variations? Definitely they give us good insight into how and why obedience takes place, but on the downside there are methodological concerns, more often relating to validity, which still needs to be addressed so that we can trust the findings of these studies. Now we have a last and simple part on obedience, which is factors affecting obedience. Number of situational factors we've already learned about from Milgram studies, but there are others as well that we need to know. Also, we need to know about individual factors. So let us understand which are some of the individual factors, meaning from within the person, which are playing a role in obedience. You can take this as what can be within a person that makes him more obedient than others. One factor is what is called the authoritarian personality. Some people are more vulnerable to authority. Their personality is such that they are submissive by nature. They find it difficult to refuse authority figures, and they tend to be harsh towards their subordinates. They expect that then when they are in senior positions, their subordinates should also be very obedient to them, just as they are to their seniors. Overall, they have a lot of faith in authority, and they really believe in the traditional notion that authority is unquestionable. That is their personality. Now the question is, where from such a personality must be coming? So it seems that it comes from harsh parenting. Some children are brought up in a home where their parents demand unquestioning obedience from them. Parents are very harsh. If their children do not obey them, they would punish them in the strictest manner possible. That could be the reason for why the child has developed the idea that he must at all costs obey authority figures always, because that is what he had to do with his parents. Another personality factor that could be playing a role in obedience is locus of control. Locus of control simply means where we locate or position the responsibility for events in our life. Who is responsible for what happens in our life? If we believe that we ourselves are responsible for what happens in our life, we have internal locus of control. So if I feel I determine my destiny, I'm a person with internal LOC. People who have internal locus of control are less likely to be obedient. Why? Because they believe that if they are performing some action, even upon being instructed by an authority figure, still they are responsible for the action they are performing. So in Milgram's experiment, even if the experimenter is telling them to give the shocks, they would believe they are the ones who are pressing the buttons to administer the shock. They would see themselves as responsible for administering the shocks and not the experimenter. Now the opposite is true for people who have an external locus of control. These people believe that their destiny is determined by the actions of others or by chance or luck factors in the environment. That is why they are more likely to obey. People who have an external locus of control believe that they are agents and that someone else decides what they do in their life. So in the case of Milgram's experiment, a person with external LOC would assume that if he's pressing the buttons to give shocks to the learner, it's not his decision. It's the experimenter's decision. He's just acting out the decision taken by the experimenter. So he won't see himself as responsible for the suffering of the learner, and that is why he's more likely to obey. Simply saying because he can pin the blame on the experimenter. Another factor which can matter is gender. It's very contradictory, the findings of research. Some suggest men are more obedient, others suggest women are more obedient. In one study, women obeyed when it came to shocking puppies, but they also mentioned that when the women were shocking these puppies, they were extremely distressed at that time. What the researchers felt was women might have obeyed more because generally they take a passive and submissive role in society compared to men. So out of socialization, they might have done such behavior. Nevertheless, they do show extreme moral strain when they are in such conditions. In another study which was done elsewhere, I think it was done in Australia, there males were found to be more obedient in a study which was done using Milgram's paradigm. So it was a replication of Milgram's study. Now here, why males would have been more obedient? Because the timing of the study was such, it was conducted at a time when feminism was coming up and women were being very assertive. That was perhaps the reason women in this study assertively told that they would not be obeying the experimenter, which men might not have expressed at that time. So we do have conflicting findings, but overall we would lean towards the side of women being more obedient than men because their role in society has been such. Another factor which is coming from within people that could make them more obedient is moral reasoning. When it comes to men, men are found to answer morality based questions of right and wrong using an ethic of justice. What we mean by this is, if we put a man in a moral dilemma, we ask him what is the right thing to do in a situation, he would propose that whatever is fair or just is the right thing to do. Let's say, for example, we ask a man, if a poor person has stolen money, should we imprison him or should we give him some discount considering that he's very poor and somewhere he was forced to steal out of his poverty? A man would say that it would be just to give the man punishment even if he's poor because he has wronged someone else and the person who's being wronged deserves justice. Whereas a woman would use the ethic of care to respond to this situation. A woman would say that we should consider that the person is poor and have some empathy towards him and maybe give him some lighter punishment. He hasn't done the act out of greed, he's done it out of helplessness. So women and men perceive morality in different ways. That is why males are more likely to be obedient because they like to follow the rules. By this reasoning, we would expect males to be more obedient because authority figures usually try to implement something that is just or fair to everybody. And a man would agree with that according to his moral reasoning. A woman would not. She would be more concerned about the safety or the suffering of the person who will have to face destructive behavior because of the obedience scenario. So she is less likely to be obedient if we go by the moral reasoning stance. One thing in general you should know about psychology, we always talk about averages or usual or typical behavior. So when we say that a woman will show the ethic of care or a man will show the ethic of justice, we are talking about a typical man or woman. We are definitely not talking about every man and woman possible. So most women or most men will behave like this. This is how you should interpret. You should not take it unconditionally that we are saying each and every man or woman is going to show this type of reasoning. Now what do we understand from these internal factors? Like how should we look at them in terms of evaluation? One weakness is there is mixed evidence on personality and gender on obedience. Like we saw, especially in the case of gender, some studies are telling us men are more obedient. The other studies are giving us exactly the opposite result. So which should we trust? It's very difficult to decide. This is a severe weakness. There are also research limitations. Many of the studies are correlational in nature. For example, when we say that someone with a greater authoritarian personality, for example, is more likely to obey, there could be other reasons for the obedience, not only the authoritarian personality. It could be that at the time when the person is asked to obey, at that time they're not able to process correctly what they are being instructed with. At that time they are feeling very intimidated by authority. We have not manipulated their personality, that we can say with confidence it's only because of their personality they are obeying. There could be a number of third variables which are playing a role. So because we are just correlating their personality with their actions, we cannot be sure personality is the reason for obedience. So these are not definitive causes of obedient behavior. But when it comes to application, that's a strength of these type of researches. What is found is there are some jobs which require a lot of obedience. The nature of the job is such. Like earlier we had seen the example of military jobs. They cannot be performed smoothly unless military men obey their seniors. So from these findings, we can learn to select the right candidates for the right job. For a job in the military or similar jobs which require a lot of obedience, for those type of jobs, we can select people who have, say, an authoritarian personality, because they'll obey more, so work will get done smoothly. And for jobs where more protest is required or more expression of the self is required, assertiveness is the right term, where assertiveness is required, say in a creative field, we need people to argue against each other, to put forth their views so that good products can be created. There we could select people who are less authoritarian by nature. So in conclusion, we can say definitely individual differences do contribute to authority. But still, we don't have research that is sufficient or convincing enough for us to be able to say exactly which are those individual factors which are playing a role. Right now, we are very speculative about the individual factors because we just have correlational findings. We don't have definitive experimental proof. Now, in the last part of this video, I will go through the situational and cultural factors which are playing a role in obedience. Just like individual factors are within a person, cultural factors are outside of the person. So what are the factors outside an individual or in the environment which can make them more or less obedient? One situational factor is legitimacy. Now many of these factors are repetitive. We've already seen them in Milgram studies and the theories which we did earlier. If we feel an authority figure is legitimate, we feel they have the right to instruct us, then we are more likely to obey. This is something especially IAL students will understand, because within social power they learn about legitimate power. So here what we are saying is, if we see the authority figure has legitimate power, has a right to command us because of the position given to them by the institution or by the government, then we are more likely to obey. If we feel a person is just trying to show authority without having any rightful stance of taking that position of authority, then we are unlikely to obey. Then coming to proximity, which we have seen as immediacy earlier, when we are right next to the authority figure, like they are physically present in front of us, then we are more likely to obey. And then there is behavior of others. If we see disobedient role models, you can connect this with Bandura's theory. If you've done GCSE psychology, many of these theories must be already known to you. Even if you haven't, you do learn about Bandura's theory this year also. So keep this in mind. Bandura said that we easily observe and imitate the behavior of role models. If we have around us some disobedient role models, just some people who are similar to us, say of a similar age or gender, and they are very assertive. If we see that even if authority figures are telling them to do something, if they don't want to do it, they won't, and they'll even challenge authority. That can inspire us to be disobedient just like them, and it could be right if we are being asked to do something destructive. Coming to cultural factors, now we always come across Hofstede's 6 cultural dimensions whenever we discuss culture. Out of those dimensions, 2 very prominent ones which are used to explain most behaviors in context are individualism, collectivism, and power distance index. So even to understand obedience, we can make use of these dimensions. People from individualistic cultures which are self-focused are less likely to be obedient. Individualistic cultures are largely the Western cultures in which people place themselves above the group. So they have more of an I feeling rather than a we feeling. Because of this, they feel self-expression is important and they would like to do what they believe in, not what someone else is instructing them to do. That is why they are less likely to be obedient. In collectivist cultures, the opposite is true. More value is given to the group over oneself. So in these cultures, people are more likely to obey because they feel that they are answerable to their social group, they are accountable. And so if some senior or authoritative person from their group is asking them to do something, they must do it regardless of whether they want to do it or not. They are not in priority to begin with in these type of cultures. Coming to power distance index, a culture like China has good power distance, meaning that, again, most Asian cultures do, meaning that authority figures are to be respected at any cost. Power is very important. Positions are very important. Who's senior, who's junior really defines behaviors in these cultures. So definitely in cultures where power plays a very important role, their obedience will be found to be higher. Now let us evaluate these situational factors. These situational factors have lot of research evidence from Milgram's variations and original study, as we've seen. Also other studies are there which have also supported them. There are many studies involving doctors and nurses, and in those it is found that when hospitals offer good reputation, or when the doctor is considered to be a legitimate senior doctor, then nurses are more likely to obey. So lots of studies are supporting these proposals. One weakness is there is a counter argument which suggests that individual factors also play a role. Situational factors themselves are not sufficient to cause obedience. They might be just one of the factors which are playing a role. For example, if we take Milgram's original experiment, though they were the minority, but 35% people did not give shocks up to 450 volts. Definitely there was something in their individual personality which made them say no, or which made them disobey, because the situation was very powerfully suppressive. How come still they did not obey? That can be attributed to their individual qualities. When it comes to cultural dimensions, those results are purely correlational. Yes, correlational support is there to show that indeed, where there is power distance in cultures, there is more obedience. But again, then can we say that culture is a cause for such behavior? We can't, because these are correlational studies. Finally, we can critique cultural differences in the sense that it is found many nations do show high levels of obedience. Undoubtedly, there are individual variations, but those are only in relative terms. People of the West are relatively less obedient than people from Asian cultures, but not drastically. There are not vast differences in obedience, because, for example, Milgram's study has been replicated in many cultures. There's no drastic difference found between one culture versus the other in how much percentage of people obey. So we can say that definitely obedience is found in all cultures and to quite a large extent. That is why obedience seems to be a universal phenomena, more attributable to nature rather than culture or nurture. So situation might not be as important as human genetics, which seem to have a tendency to obey. Overall, if we have to take a balanced conclusion of this section, we can say yes, situational factors do strongly impact obedience. That is prominent from so many researches done in the area. Role of culture is little less clear because it's all correlational, and cultural universalism is seen more than culture specific behaviors. So we need to investigate more into cultures and maybe give lesser importance to culture than we give to individual factors. Okay, so that's a review of the social psychology, one part of it, the obedience part of it. The next part for IAL students is on conformity, and for GCE students is on prejudice. I'm not sure which one I'll be uploading next. I will upload both of them. I don't know which will come first and which second. I also don't know when I will be uploading those parts. So thank you for your patience in advance, and thank you for watching this video. I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.